This podcast is brought to you by LMU Munich.
I'm not going to be talking so much about how the brain works tonight, or what constitutes the mind, or what a state of the mind looks like, right? But rather how these two domains, if you want to keep them separate, might be related in a way. If you've never seen a state of the mind, I've chosen as the poster image for my presentation a painting from one of my favorite movements in art history, from Italian Futurism. This painting is called State of Mind, number 2. A painting by Umberto Boccioni from the early years of the 20th century. All right, so for anyone who is doing research on the mind's interaction with the world, Jaegwon Kim's paper, The Nonreductivist Troubles with Mental Causation from 92-93 is a major reference point, and it is for me too. This is a quote from the paper, and Kim tells us how to possibly relate mind and body. Mental events, he writes, can be and sometimes are causes and effects of physical events, and changes in a mind can be causes or effects of changes in a body. This means that events of both kinds can occur as links in the same causal chains. If you pick a physical event and trace its causal ancestry or posterity, you may run into mental events. And similarly, if you start off with a mental event, right? I think this is something that we're quite comfortable with, right? Nothing that we would disagree at face value anyways. And it appears in, so this kind of reasoning appears in everyday discourse, I would say. So here are some examples, right? We would say something like, pain makes us take a pill, right? Where pain is something, not like fever that you can go and measure quantitatively, but something that you would report qualitatively, rather. Or something that you would find in newspapers. The stock market is going crazy because investors fear financial loss, right? Where fear is something taken from the mental domain and the stock market going crazy, that's rather worldly going on. And finally, something very familiar to the philosopher, our craving for coffee drives us to the coffee shop, right? Okay, the mind makes me go there and order a large cup of coffee, for example. So, and this leads us to the main question of my talk today. How can we capture our intuitions about this causal nexus in a formal way, and moreover, in a way that fits in well with how other entities interact with the world? That's going to be the main goal for tonight. So here's our agenda. We'll start by keeping the domains distinct and looking at the domains separately. We'll go on, and I'll invite you to go on a little detour with me through linguistics, and we'll look at Cambridge change variables and at the interventionist account of causation, and see how we can make those compatible in a certain way. We'll go on and extend the framework that the interventionist account holds in store for us to a certain variant of causal models, and we'll be climbing some mind-brain ladders in the very last part of this talk. All right, but let's start at the beginning and look at the domains separately. So mental events first, right? The mind. Mental events and intentional states. When it comes to intentionality, this concept is almost intimately related to the name of Franz Brentano, who states in the second half of the 19th century that we can define mental phenomena by saying that they are those phenomena which contain an object intentionally within themselves. What does that mean? He introduces intentionality as power of the mind to be about something, and as reference to a content, direction toward an object. That you find in his Psychologie vom empirischen Standpunkte, from 1874. So we're talking about intentional states here, although some philosophers claim that there are mental states without intentionality. But the focus of this talk is going to be intentional mental states, right? Where reaching a state can be understood as an event. All right? Okay. Good. On the other side, we have the brain. What I don't want to do is I don't want to equate a particular brain with a certain configuration frozen at a certain point in time with a physical state. I don't want to do that. I rather want to say something like a particular brain at a particular point in time can be in a certain state or is in a certain state if it exhibits certain properties that make it belong to a certain class or type, right? So we're talking at a type level, and that will fit in very well with the causal framework that we're going to be looking at. Right. And just to quickly talk about intentional states and intentions, because they dangerously sound alike in a way, but we want to keep them separate for a moment and then say how we can relate them again. Intending something, right? Having an intention, forming an intention, refers to the mind being in a special intentional state. As I said before, for the purpose of this talk, intentional here and mental will be interchangeable, right? In forming an intention, the mind is consciously directed towards a purpose or a goal. And we're running into our original puzzle again. If the means for achieving something intended are of physical nature, we arrive at the riddle of mental causation. How can an intentional state make something happen in the physical world, right? Okay. If you have a look at Kim's paper, we can try to kind of condense all the troubles he has with mental causation on one slide and within one diagram, and we'll refer back to that during the course of this talk. So when he writes about the non-reductivist standpoint, he explicitly refers to non-reductive physicalism. What is that? Okay? It has four main claims. The first is physical monism, saying that all concrete particulars are physical. Right? This little diagram on the right shows the physical realm on the left and the mental domain on the right side. And all concrete particulars are on the left side. It comes with anti-reductionism. Mental properties are not reducible to physical properties. That's why we need those two sides to start with. And three, the physical realization thesis. All mental properties are physically realized. Okay? The physical realizes the mental in a certain way. That is, whenever an organism or system instantiates a mental property M, it has some physical property P such that P realizes M in organisms of its kind. Or in short, the brain realizes the mind, if you will. And mental realism, right? Mental properties are real properties of objects and events. The mind is something that we would like to attribute reality to. Okay, now so with all these claims at hand, what can we make of those, right? One standpoint, one perspective we could assume is epiphenomenalism, right? We could say that those real entities on the right side are real entities that do not interact with other entities. It's called the epiphenomenalist standpoint here. The mind doesn't really interact with the physical world. It's real, but it doesn't interact. But, and Kim is quoting Jerry Fodor, and his postulate, to be real is to have causal powers, right? We cannot make sense of reality other than saying it has causal powers, right? That's the essence of being real in a way. So we would like to integrate some link from the right side to the left side, other than or over and beyond this realization relation. I've marked it with a dashed arrow and labeled it with a question mark because we also have the causal closure of the physical, another postulate, right? Only physical entities can have causal influence on other physical entities. Only P's can influence other P's, P prime, for example, at a later time if time runs from top to bottom, as in this diagram. And moreover, P alone suffices to produce P prime, right? No matter what M looks like. M can change in any way. It would not contribute to P dashes, to P primes actual realization. That's called overdetermination, right? P suffices to determine its realizations down the line. What does that leave us with? Big question mark, all right? Okay, let me invite you on a little detour, right? I would like to go into linguistics for a moment and look at a very similar, structurally similar example. Try to see how we can somehow get to terms with that example with one of the more prominent accounts of causation, and then try to see how we can carry over the findings from linguistics back to the mind-body problem. I'll talk about the Cambridge change first. So the Cambridge change, the term Cambridge change, or the term or Cambridge change variables were coined by Peter Geach in the late 1960s. Peter Geach was a philosopher and logician teaching at Birmingham and Leeds, I guess. Just recently died last year in December, and dedicated quite a bit of his life to the concept of identity. All right, and this is one of his stories about an intimate identity relation. The term Cambridge change refers to his Cambridge philosopher colleagues like Russell and MacTaggart, and he gives us this little story. You've all heard of Socrates, I guess, and how his life came to an end, maybe. So that'll be the starting point for my story, the trial of Socrates, right? Socrates is found guilty of corrupting the youth of Athens, right? So he was telling the kids all about philosophy, and that was counted as a crime back in the day. So he was found guilty and sentenced to death by drinking a cup of poison, a cup of hemlock. Consequently, to cut things short, his wife's son Hippie becomes a widow. All right. But now here's the question. Here's the problem. And think about it yourself for a minute. Is Socrates' death causing or not causing Xanthippus becoming a widow? Any intuitions here? So usually when I pose this question or tell the story, there's two answers right away, right? So there's those people who say, no, cannot be, right? The more physics-oriented people, right? Who say causation usually takes some time, right? But you know, what we have here is instantly, you know? It's instant causation, and we actually don't want to have this. So even when we take Xanthippe and put her in a different possible world or so, right? She still becomes a widow there at the same time of Socrates' death. So it's more like a definition or something like that, but certainly not causation, right? And there's the second camp of people who say that, yes, but you know, we have this kind of counterfactual understanding of causation, so Xanthippe would still, wouldn't have become a widow were it not for Socrates' death, right? So that's oftentimes how we check causality in everyday life. So, yes.
But isn't that exactly the example that Lewis is using to say that's not causation?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So he's in the first camp then. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Exactly. So, but right. So we have these two answers. We have conflicting intuitions in this example. What can we make of that? Of course, if I'm asking, is that causation or not, I would, as we do it here in mathematical philosophy, I would like to take this conceptual problem and translate it into a mathematical problem, and then, run the mathematical machinery and, come up with a mathematical answer, translate it back to the conceptual problem, and tell you uniquely if that's causation or not. Okay. And I want to do that. Okay. So let's model this problem in computable structures, right? And I'll take one of the more prominent frameworks that are around these days. I'll take the BaseNet causal framework, right? And here are some premises to motivate this framework. And I know many of you know that. Let me just quickly run through the premises. So, for example, you'll find in the title of Wolfgang Spohn's paper from 2000 that Bayesian nets are all there is to causal dependence. Right? We'll see in a moment what these nets look like, but that's a pretty strong claim here, with the idea being that causal Bayesian networks map stable, autonomous, deterministic causal mechanisms. Okay? We'll get a graphical expression for that in a minute. And the relata of causal claims are events, okay, represented by random variables. Okay? And one important point is that the relata are distinct events. So the modeler, the causal modeler, is to make sure that her variables she uses in her model don't overlap. Okay? And then this idea that causes bring about effects by making a difference, right, in the otherwise unperturbed normal course of events, right? We look out for events that make a difference and bring about causes in the course. And now this leads us directly to the interventionist concept of causality. Wiggling the cause affects the effect, not vice versa, right? So just look at the light switch here. If I flip the switch, the light will go on, right? But it won't work the other way, right? If I take a battery and a bit of wire and hold it to the bulb, right? I can switch the light on, but that won't make the switch flip, right? Okay, so there's some asymmetry going on here. And that goes, so causation, that's a pretty strong intuition that we carry around, is asymmetric in this way. Now these kinds of manipulations, flipping the switch, right, determine causal directionality. That's one of the premises. And moreover, they can be formalized suitably. And you'll find that in, for example, Judea Pearl's seminal book, Causality, from 2000, or in the extended second edition from 2009, right? But he's not the only one. You'll find that in the work of the CMU researchers, Spertus, Clemore, and Shines, for example, or then from a more philosophical perspective in James Woodward's Making Things Happen, for example. Okay. Right. So Bayesian networks are based on a set of independence assumptions, right? That's what's at the core. Independence assumptions between events. And those can be expressed in compatible graphs, in directed acyclic graphs, as shown here, right? That graph doesn't contain any loops. That's what makes it acyclic. This simple example contains two types of nodes, right? You have those outer nodes and you have inner nodes. The outer are called exogenous nodes and the inner endogenous nodes, where the outer nodes, the upper nodes here, represent our knowledge about the world, the situation, the background, circumstances, and so on. Whereas the inner nodes here receive their values along those and through those directed edges here along the direction of the edges, right? So, and these directed edges represent the mechanisms underlying the structures, right? If we want to use these kinds of structures for causal reasoning, we add one more requirement, the causal Markov condition, that pretty much says that direct causes screen off direct effects from any other causal influence, right? So, or in computational terms, to uniquely compute the value of this variable represented as a node in the graph, you only need to look at the value of its parent variable here, right? Okay. Now, if that's a representation of our assumptions about some, say, laboratory setting, right? Then we can try and use this to make predictions about our actual setting in the lab, right? So, say we have 4 variables, we represent them as nodes, we draw edges and direct them, and we observe in the lab setting that the variable capital P exhibits the value small p, and alike for q, that shows small q as a value, right? Now, what Pearl, for example, tells us, he gives us a formal framework to use the mathematical description to perform a virtual intervention, right, in the lab setting, if you will, in the representation of this lab setting. So we can virtually go into our model lab and turn a knob or pull a lever or flip a switch. We can wiggle a variable, say p, to check if some other variable changes accordingly, say q in our test case here. And he gives us a definition of how to do that, and that's expressed by the do operation, right? We do something in the mathematical model. We do p and set it to a deviant value, right? To a value, to a different value from the one we just observed. And to break the symmetry, right? To break the symmetric flow of information in these networks, right? We, by performing an intervention, we clip those edges that would propagate information upward in the graph. We don't want backwards causation, right? And that is how we express that, right? We clip those edges. All right, let's turn the wheel of time a bit and go back to David Hume and the year 1748. And you all know the quotes. Let's just quickly go through that again. He says in this twofold definition of cause and effect that we may define a cause to be an object followed by another, and where all the objects similar to the first are followed by objects similar to the second. This first part of his famous quote gave rise to all kinds of regularity theories, right? That turned out, most of which turned out to be not very fruitful or successful in the end, because they couldn't evade any, the charges of not being able to distinguish causes and effects, because regularity in a way runs both ways, okay? But the second part of the quote is much more interesting and much more useful for our purposes here. Or in other words, Hume says, where if the first object had not been, the second never had existed. So this was used by David Lewis in his 1973 causation as a starting point for his definition of cause and effect in terms of his possible world semantics, right? And what David Lewis did, he introduced small miracles that kind of made us leave our actual world and move to the closest world in which the potential, the supposed cause wouldn't hold, to check what's going on there, right? Judea Pearl is a much more down-to-earth engineer, right, and computer scientist. He doesn't believe in so much in miracles, not even small ones, and devises these structural transformations, right, on well-tested and much refined mathematical descriptions of what's going on. Well-tested in statistics and in the special sciences. But let me point out what's important in his framework. His interventions he also calls local surgeries, right? And that is important. So these interventions are devised and defined in such a way that you can separately modify your distinct events, right? So, and you do that locally, right? You only break the links that would propagate any information backwards from the very variable that you are intervening on, right? Local. And you can modify separate variables separately. That's important here. How does this help Socrates and Zanhippie? Not so much, it turns out, right? Socrates' death and Zanhippie's becoming a widow cannot be embedded. That'll be our finding in a standard causal model, right? One cannot modify these events separately, right? So our little program going into math, picking a framework, phrasing the conceptual question in mathematical terms, kind of fails at this point, right? We see that the framework doesn't quite suit our need here because we need a new type of edge, okay? It should be non-directed, it should be non-causal, but rather informational. It should be capable of propagating information instantaneously, if you will. It should not be deactivated by any means. And it should work like synonyms, think of mathematical inner definitions, or logical relations, which, in my opinion, certainly all belong to the pool of knowledge we use for causal reasoning, right? And a side remark here, in standard statistical modeling, both of these events, right, would be usually collapsed into one single variable. But in this conceptual analysis here, we would like to disambiguate, right? And in the causal analysis, spatial separation, for example, should find its expression too. Okay. Now, how can we maybe extend or modify our framework, the causal models we just looked at, to maybe embed those different types of knowledge we have and we want to use, right? How can we do that? So here's a suggestion, and let me call this causal knowledge patterns, and I'll give you an example first, right? You see stuff that we had on the slide before, right? We have directed edges, we have nodes, they still represent events, but I'll just throw in one of these edges that we would like to have in here, right? A non-directed edge labeled with a functional symbol C, right, for contour, because I think of these relations more as epistemic contours, right? They're about information. So bidirectional epistemic contours are defined to link inseparable variables and propagate values instantaneously. This is an example. We want to intervene on the A, we want to wiggle the A and see what happens down at the Y, right? And this is how the epistemic contour should be working then. We intervene up at the A. These links are broken, right? Because we don't want any information to propagate backwards up in the graph. We don't want to break this link. It should not be broken, but it should propagate any information that we now have over here instantaneously over to B, right? So yeah, that's what it does. If that's if we have the a function here that we know about, then we can compute the value of B uniquely, and this causal link from B to Y then takes care of propagating the information we now have at B, yeah, uniquely, and we can compute the value of Y down here. That's how these epistemic contours should be working, and how the framework should do its work. So we can do it formally, and that's just one slide, right? So to show you that we can all do it in a formal way too. A causal knowledge pattern in this way is a quadruple consisting of two types of variables, u and v, of directed edges f, say, and of c, our contours, where the first, where the triple that collects the first three elements is a causal model in the standard sense over n variables, where, and let me just quickly run through that, where, as I briefly mentioned before, we have background variables, that's the exogenous outer variables, we have observed variables, the inner endogenous variables, and we have those deterministic functions that are represented as directed edges in the graph. Okay? Right, so far so good. And now we just need to be talking about the C part, because that's the new part, right? Everything else you'll find in the literature and taken care of. So U, V, and F is a causal basenet model as before over n variables, and C now is a set of epistemic contours, a set of 1-1 functions. Yeah, I'm focusing on 1-1 functions for the purpose of this talk. Cij, where the C is just a label for the edge, and I and j are numbers of variables that the edge is relating, such that for all Cij, for all these contours, we say that they are not self loops, right? They translate values from one variable to the other variable, and if you take 3 and 4 together, this set is closed under inversion. So to make it 1-1 functions, right? That's just a formal explication of all the intuitions I listed before. Okay, with that at hand, we can now, look at different types of structures that emerge in this framework. That'll be the most important one for us today. So, say we have two domains here, or frameworks of description on the left and on the right, that are tightly connected on each level by epistemic contours, where this might be expressing reductive relations or non-reductive relations, right? We have translation, translation structures that come in L shapes. We have U shapes that might be something like independent experimental setups or so. And we have the unrestricted case, right, where in this roof structure over our epistemic contour you have converging causal histories. Anything, anything more complex than these before. Now that's what I've been doing in the rather graph theoretical part of my research. I've identified various types of structures and defined inference principles, right, for all these types, for atomic and compound interventions, on different sets of variables, and with different observational data at hand. So investigating all these subcases then makes it possible to tell precisely under what circumstances a given CKP, a given causal knowledge pattern, can be used to consistently compute the effect of interventions, right? And there might be some that are not useful at all, that you would have to refine or modify, and there are some that are useful only in certain cases, and with those inference principles at hand, they tell you under what cases. All right. Now, one very first requirement for these inference rules to work at all, right? To get started at all, is the requirement of acyclicity. That can't be translated, directly into causal knowledge patterns, but we want that in a way, right? We still don't want any loops in the framework, right? So we need to introduce acyclicity for causal knowledge patterns, and we'll do that by formulating a collapsibility. That's a term that I use for these semi-DAGs, right? Because we now have directed edges and portions of the graph that are not non-directed. So a collapsibility, quite straightforward, but has to be mentioned at least once. A causal knowledge pattern K is called acollapsible if pulling together all nodes of each EC clique. So down here, X1 and X3 form an EC clique because they're connected by an epistemic contour in the semi-DAG D of K into one single compound node per clique, right? While leaving intact all arrows pointing at or rooting in any of the unified nodes, thereby removing all undirected edges, right? Results in a directed acyclic graph. Quite straightforward with this minimal example up here, right? You just, as if those epistemic contours were rubber bands, right? You let go and they snap together, right? And you end up with a directed graph. And if that is acyclic, then we have our CKP acyclic as well, right? Pretty straightforward. But that's how one can do that. And then you may ask, okay, but still, what about the Markov assumption? Markov assumption was that, direct causes screen of their direct effects, right? Let's look at, this little example, the same structure as before, but before we intervened on A, and now we're going to be intervening on B over here, right? If we do it without precautions, we end up with a conflict here. So let me give you concrete functional assignments here. So the value of A should be computed by taking the minimum of the values of x1 and x2. The epistemic contour is just the identity relation, and okay, that's not so important down here. There's some function that takes the value of B and computes it to assign Y its unique value. Okay, so right, that's what we have here in that situation. And now we have observations, right? We observe 1 for x1 and 0 for x2. The minimum of that would assign A the value 0, right? And now we intervene over here at B and assign 1 to B, okay? Since C is the identity, the value of A would then be 1 as well, right? But that's in conflict with the assignment from above, right? So our inference rules need to take care of such a situation, right? All right. Since A and B receive incompatible values, incompatible relative to the formulation of the epistemic contour. So we need to say something about this case, and let me motivate what we can do here. Epistemic contours mark variables, right? Again, that cannot be modified separately. They bridge to, say, intentionally different aspects, synonymy, translation, logical equivalence or so, of the same extension, okay? And they do so meaningfully because different theories or background stories apply to them. In other words, intervening is intervening on extensions, okay? So a single intervention anywhere in an EC clique, anywhere, right, lifts all variables, should lift all variables in this clique from the influence of their parents. So over here, if we were to intervene on x1, right, what we want is we want to free x1 from the influence of x2, right? And that can only be achieved if we clip both of these arrows onto this epistemic contour clique down here. And that are both variables, x1 and x3, right? And of course, one more thing, opposing interventions are also ruled out, right? It would make sense to have one intervention here and an incompatible intervention on the other side, right, of the same coin, if you will. Okay, that's the technical bits that we need for our argument. And finally, a bit of solace for Xantippe, right? We can now test informational links as parts of causal chains in the case of our, Cambridge change variables. Still, we have Socrates' death on the left side here, and we have Xantippe's becoming a widow on the right side. But now, and this time, we relate those two events by an epistemic contour, C. Okay? A definitional link, a definition, right? And what we want to say by integrating this epistemic contour here is that we are on the side of David Lewis, or on the side of, the first camp I was referring to before, who say that this is a definition and not a causal relation, right? But it figures in causal inference, and that's the upshot of this here. If we extend our stories on both sides, right, we might tell a background story about Socrates' death. We might, include the event of Socrates actually drinking the cup of poison, the cup of hemlock up here. And now test that for yourself. To me, it feels much more natural and more comfortable, right? Socrates drinking the hemlock causes Xantippe to become a widow, right? That doesn't go against intuition as much as, saying that Socrates' death causes Xantippe becoming a widow. Or you might say something like, Socrates' death allows Xantippe to marry again, right? This is across frameworks here, right? This is across frameworks of description, or across causal theories, if you will, right? And we can even test, the long one here. Socrates drinking a cup of hemlock makes it possible for Xantippe to marry again, right? Different phrasings, right? To, in the Nancy Cartwright sense, give a thick concept rather than only say cause here. But what's important here is that this non-causal link in the middle was used as a non-causal subportion of a longer causal path, all right? And that feels much more comfortable now. Okay. How can we take our findings now and, carry them over to our mind-body problem? That's the original picture, right? That we used to condense Kim's troubles with mental causation. All right, we have the P side, we have the M side. We don't know yet what to do with causation across frameworks, and we don't know yet what to make of the realization relation here. But after having done so much, spent so much time in abstract structures, I thought, I didn't feel so confident about my own intuitions anymore, and I thought I should talk to other people about structures of precisely that kind, right? And so that's what I did. I had a conversation with quite influential thinkers, and here's a little transcript of the conversation. One of them said about structures of this very kind, Of course, there is in a case like that no question of mechanical disturbance of the system P. But there is essentially the question of an influence on the very conditions which define the possible types of predictions regarding the future behavior of the system P. Quite cryptic, and another one answered right away, indeed, I have very little idea what this means. So, luckily, I found a third one who, was able to mediate and explain a bit, and that's what he said. Intervening at M at time t does not change the real physical situation at P, but it changes our state of knowledge about that situation, and therefore it changes the predictions we are able to make about P prime at some time T prime. And, this made me quite, comfortable to go on and try to kind of embed, Kim's troubles in a causal knowledge pattern because, there's knowledge in here. And, that's what I was looking out for. So, take out the causal link here and try with me to find Kim's troubles in a causal knowledge pattern. We'll start, by unifying efficient and formal relations in one pattern for consistent causal inference, right? We'll intervene on the mental side now. We'll wiggle the M to see what happens on the P side. And we'll use the CKP framework for that. So, I'll go in this structure and wiggle the M2, right? I'll do small m2. I'll set the variable m2 to small m2. And our inference rules now tell us that I have to get rid of the accompanying link here between P1 and P2 to cut the links across this level, right? In other words, P cannot be in any other way than, realizing the M that we, are setting here on the right side. Our epistemic contour C2, so corresponding to time T2, now propagates information across domains. And this causal link down here takes care of, efficient physical causation on the left side. What did we just do? We wiggled the M, right? We said that this is not that this single epistemic contour is more a definitional link or realization in Kim's terms. But P3 down here changed accordingly. So this is the interventionist intuition of what it is to be a cause, right? M2 just caused P3. Okay. To be honest, this conversation, I didn't have it in person, and I haven't given you the names yet. The first one up there, that's Niels Bohr. Okay. The second, the skeptical reply, that's John Bell. And the third is Edie Janes, who's collecting this, conversation and kind of mediating between Bohr, Bell, and Einstein in his paper Clearing Up Mysteries, the original goal from '89. Of course, this is not about mind and brain, to be honest. I stole this. But it's about structures of the same kind, right? It's about the EPR paradox, Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox. So what figures in this paradox is, of course, quantum entanglement, right? Which lends its name to the title of this talk. Applying the CKP framework to EPR is a different talk, but a similar exercise. All right, let me wrap up by listing our findings here. What have we done? Physical and intentional states can be accommodated in the general framework of causal knowledge patterns, in which knowledge about efficient causes and formal informational links, right, causa formalis in a way, as potential subpaths of causal chains, right, are used for consistent causal inference. Intuitions about the mind as a difference maker are preserved in this way, right, contra epiphenomenalism. And that's how I would like to, what I would like to say here, that the origin of conflicting intuitions about the mind's interaction with the world might be better understood by sorting the knowledge we use for causal inference in this way, right? And lastly, using epistemic contours as an explication of realization is actually quite in accordance with Kim's idea of physicalism or something near enough. That's the title of a book by Kim from 2005, in which he claims that the mental might be functionally reducible, but remains qualitatively distinct from the brain. And CKPs precisely allow for semantically integrating both aspects at the same time. Thank you very much.